Welcome back to the program. We are joined again by Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University and a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. I'm very glad you had the time to speak today because there seems to be a lot of developments going on, both with the war, the possible diplomatic path, and also heard the speculations about Iran, if not developing a nuclear weapon, it would show its capability to do so. Again, I want to ask how much is speculation, but again, maybe we start at the beginning. What is it? How do you see the current state of the war? Because we now saw that, the U.S. appears to be stepping up against Iran, and at the same time, we see Iran having struck Kuwait. So how can we best understand what's happening at the moment?
Well, ever since the ceasefire began, supposed ceasefire, the United States has effectively, almost immediately afterwards, a few days afterwards, it began siege warfare against Iran, which is an act of war. And but it's a double-edged sword because the global economy is crashing as a result. Uh, in addition to that, every now and then the United States carries out some sort of attack on Iranian territory. Iran has never initiated any ceasefire breach. It's always been the United States. And it's interesting that when Trump says in that part of the world these things happen, no, it's just the United States and its allies that are always breaching ceasefires. No one else does that. The Iranians, though, every time when the Americans would attack, they would retaliate. But this time round was different. The Iranian retaliation was very harsh. And two things could have happened. Either the Americans could have again carried out further strikes in sort of retaliation, even though they themselves started this, or they could have stopped. And so far they've stopped. And I think that shows that the Iranian escalation was something that the Americans did not want, at least at this stage. And this comes almost simultaneous with what happened in Lebanon. Right before this latest incident, as you know better than I, and your viewers obviously know better than I, the Israeli regime decided to flatten Beirut, especially the southern part of Beirut. And they've been saying it openly. They don't say it much in the Western media, obviously, because compromised. But the Iranians said that if the Israeli regime starts bombing civilian infrastructure in the capital, Beirut, that it will fire missiles at northern Israel. And that caused this conversation between Trump and Netanyahu, where this completely discredited Axios put out a quote of Trump, which in this particular case may indeed be true, but ultimately the Israeli regime refrained from bombing Beirut, which would indicate that at this moment, at least, the United States does not want escalation at any cost. And that could be because, or is probably because, the global economic situation is, as we've been discussing for weeks now, moving closer and closer to the cliff. And we are indeed now very close. Experts that you know, again, better than I, have energy experts, oil experts, economists have been saying that the month of June will be a turning point with regards to the economic crisis, because the strategic reserves for oil will be depleted or close to depletion, and of course the shortages of all the other goods that are missing now on the market because of the siege on the Strait of Hormuz, such as helium and all the different petrochemicals and LNG, as well as fertilizers. All of these things, interestingly, from what I've read, a lot of these different goods, these commodities, they too will be in very short supply during this period, June, July. So there's a lot of overlap in the shortages in the different commodities that are going to be experiencing shortages. In any case, I think that probably the United States is very fearful of escalation now because they know that if there's escalation, then there are no negotiations. And there will be no more messages being sent back and forth. Of course, when I say negotiations, I mean written messages that go back and forth. This is basically what is going on between Iran and the United States. The Americans send a written message through Pakistan. It goes to Iran. They read it. They write a response, and they send it back through Pakistan to the United States. So when you look at the harsh Iranian response in the Persian Gulf region, and the reason why they struck Kuwait and Bahrain was because these two regimes were deeply involved in the American strikes on Iran. So the harsh Iranian response in the Persian Gulf and the major threat that it made to the Israeli regime to refrain from bombing Beirut, in both cases, the United States have, for now, backed down or forced the Israeli regime to back down. And I think that says a lot.
Yeah, so to summarize, the US continues these probing attacks until the Iranians push back. We continue to, we'll see the global economic situation goes from bad to worse. And yeah, I've heard the same thing, that this month could be a very difficult turning point. But Trump, though, his whole approach to this, he's become the boy who cried wolf. That is, on day one, he talks about how close they are with peace with the Iranians. On day two, he will destroy Iran. Day three, he goes back to being really close to deal. So it's a bit back and forth. And again, his motivations, well, there are many of them. Some signalings to the Iranians, his own public, the stock market. There's a lot of considerations here. But in terms of actually reaching something that looks like a peace, how possible do you think it is? Because as Iran says, Lebanon has to be included in a ceasefire, in a peace deal. That is, they can't simply stop the fighting with Iran and then start plowing through Lebanon and essentially bombing Beirut to the ground. So, and at the same time, the Strait of Hormuz, what do the Americans demand there versus what the Iranians can deliver? Because from what I understand, the Iranians already essentially operating a toll booth there. That is, it's the new realities are already in place, and then they don't seem like they're willing to walk this one back. So, is Trump trapped in this conflict now, or do you think there's a pathway to peace through diplomacy, that is?
You're right. Iran is receiving fees at the Strait of Hormuz, and this will not go away. This is going to be a permanent feature of the Persian Gulf in future, and that is, of course, something which the United States and the Israeli regime should blame Trump and Netanyahu for, because Iran never had such an ambition before. But more important than the fees that they get at the Strait is the fact that many ships will no longer be able to pass through, meaning U.S. Military vessels, but also ships that are linked to the Israeli regime will no longer be able to use the Strait of Hormuz. You may be surprised to know that among the, I don't know, 1,500 or so ships that are stuck in the Persian Gulf, uh, quite a few of them, I don't want to give a specific number. I've been told over 200, but I'm not sure if it's true, have at least partial Israeli ownership. And they don't necessarily take goods to and from the regime. For example, they may take goods from Bahrain to Kuwait, or from Iraq to the Emirates, or something, and that sort of thing. So in future, ships affiliated to the regime will no longer be able to use the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz. And again, the people in the regime or in the United States can blame Trump and Netanyahu for this catastrophic change of the circumstances. With regards to peace, that's difficult to say because, of course, two key issues exist that the Iranians are not going to compromise. There are a number, but one is, of course, the siege on the Strait of Hormuz. and the other is the end to the war in Lebanon and the full retreat of the Israeli regime from Lebanon and Gaza. The killing, the slaughter in Gaza has to end, and the ceasefire in Gaza has to be implemented. That's something that the Iranians have said. If anyone looks at the text, they write across, there has to be an end to the wars across the region. But the particular focus has been on Lebanon because the genocidal attacks on Lebanon now are even worse than what we see in Gaza these days. So it includes Gaza, it includes Lebanon. There must be a full retreat in the case of Lebanon, and these are issues that are very difficult for the United States. The Trump would like to see Lebanon removed from the agreement and to have the Israelis destroy Lebanon. But Iran won't have that. And as I said, Iran is also saying that the ceasefire, because the problem with Gaza, Glenn, is that countries in our region helped Trump put Gaza in this horrific situation. Erdogan, Abdullah of Jordan, Sisi, the despots in the region, Aliyev in Azerbaijan, and rulers from across the region and across the world went to Egypt for that fake ceasefire celebration of Trump's. Not only did they whitewash his genocide, but they gave a stamp of approval for that. See, there is a ceasefire in Gaza where the Israeli regime controls more than half of it in accordance with that ceasefire. But we've been seeing slaughter ever since. Almost 1,000 Palestinians have been murdered since the ceasefire. Women and children. I mean, if the Israeli snipers shoot into tents where kids are having class and kill the kids. And they burned kids alive just a couple of days ago in their tent. I mean, this is not something directed towards Hamas, even though in a ceasefire, it doesn't matter if it's Hamas or Islamic Jihad or anyone else or Hezbollah or anyone. When you have a ceasefire, you have a ceasefire. But in any case, since there is a ceasefire in place, in the case of Gaza, Iran can only demand so much because that ceasefire was agreed to by Hamas under great pressure from these regional regimes that did nothing for them, unlike Iran in axis of resistance. So unless the Israeli regime is forced to leave, well, which is going to be difficult, but the resistance in Lebanon has been very effective. I mean, the Iranian threat has played a major role, but Hezbollah is performing exceptionally well. And I think a lot of your viewers, if not all of them, have seen images of drones striking Israeli regime targets across southern Lebanon and even northern occupied Palestine. So difficult to achieve with these sort of differences, but it's not impossible. And Trump needs an agreement. The Americans have had a greater sense of urgency with, a greater sense of urgency with regards to an agreement with Iran than we've ever seen before, especially in recent weeks. But the counter forces are very strong. Just one thing, Glenn, and that is, I think that the statement that came out from between putting that Trump insulted Netanyahu, I think that this was actually intended to weaken Netanyahu, and that it's not just Trump. I think that even Zionists who are, Israeli firsters in the White House, very powerful Zionists in the United States, may be concluding that Netanyahu should gradually be removed from power. Because unlike in previous cases where Axios did a lot of fake news on differences between the U.S. president and Netanyahu, and we are approaching the anniversary of the blitzkrieg attack on Iran last year, the 12-day war, where we had the same sort of news where Netanyahu and Trump had differences, and Trump wanted to give negotiations more time, and then they attacked Iran. It was obvious that it was a lie, and it was just basically to deceive the Iranians or help deceive the Iranians. this was about now last year, 3-4 days from now last year, when probably this Axios article came out. But in this case, it's different because Netanyahu has been humiliated at home, and he's being attacked by his opponents, but also by his political allies. This is very different from previous Axios so-called revelations. And it's also bad for the Israeli regime because, to have Trump say everyone hates Israel and so on, and to have even Fox News repeat this, at least I saw it on its Twitter account, is a big thing. So I think that uh, they there is probably an attempt to bring an end to Netanyahu's reign, which will have elections in a few months. But again, this is just speculation on my view.
Yeah, well, whenever I talk to people like Professor Mearsheimer, he always makes the point that while the U.S. and Israel is joined at the hip, if the key strategic interest of the United States is threatened, that this could be kind of the moment where the U.S. Essentially elevates U.S. interest above Israeli. That is, if it's peripheral interest, it will put Israel first. But if it's a core interest of the United States, then reality will have to be respected. Again, speculations or a thesis at least. But it is interesting that it's not just the core interest of the US, but also part of the Israeli, because again, from the Israelis' point of view, they often, I think, seek a more strategic depth to enhance their security. So essentially seizing territories and sowing some chaos in its neighboring countries. Along the lines of Syria. I assume that's what they're going for in Lebanon as well. But what you're talking about, though, if Trump is trying to rein in the Israelis, aren't we talking about essentially ending the greater Israel project here?
Well, I'm not sure if it's so much Trump rather than forces more important than Trump. And those who, I'm not quite sure, Trump himself said, put this into Axios, or people around Trump said, maybe it's time to put such a quotation or quote in Axios. Whether it's accurate or semi-accurate, it doesn't matter. What the public has been fed, and the widespread impact of this quote from Trump has had a huge impact. I think that the Greater Israel Project is going to bring about the destruction of Israel. And I think that this whole 2.5 to 3 years of genocide that we've seen has pushed the Israeli regime towards its ultimate destruction. Because the greatest threat to the Israeli regime is not the armies of neighboring countries. It is the delegitimization of the regime in the eyes of the world. So 2.5 to 3 years of genocide, which is ongoing. And then in addition to that, the global economic hardship that the regime is imposing, because across the world, people are saying, I mean, for example, let's look at India. The Indian government has shown, unfortunately, a lot of support for the Israeli regime for the last couple of years, since the genocide. This particular administration, Prime Minister Modi's government. Yet the Israeli regime has shown complete disregard for the interests of the people in the war against Iran and what's happened to the Strait of Hormuz. So the hardship in India or in Uganda or in Argentina or wherever is going to be blamed on Trump and Netanyahu, and is being blamed on them. And according to colleagues in India, the mood in that country has become because the majority are opposed to Trump. They dislike Trump now. And of course, the same is true with the Israeli regime. The mood has changed. So when a place like India has this shift, then you can imagine how it is elsewhere. I think this is the greatest defeat of all. Also, I think that right now, this is the Iranian strategy. I think that for weeks, this has been the Iranian strategy, that to increase the pain on the Americans until they reach an agreement, and continue down this road until the United States comes to the conclusion that they have to prioritize their own interests over the Israeli regime. So the siege which the Americans have imposed, which again is a double-edged sword, it's destroying, it's wrecking the global economy, and it's hurting Iranians, no doubt about that. The difficult economic difficulties in Iran are clear, but the Iranians will see this through. However, uh, however, whatever pain is inflicted on Iranians know that this is a fight for their survival. So what the Iranians are attempting to do is not to wreck the global economy. That's not an Iranian objective at all. Uh, but they want to continue down this course of action until the United States reaches a point that if we continue with this siege and with this policy, it will wreck our economy. And so we have to make a decision that prioritizes the United States, the interests of the United States over that of the Israeli regime. This is, I think, similar to what Professor Mearsheimer was speaking of. And I believe personally, and I have not seen anyone else say this, so it may just be inaccurate speculation on my behalf. I believe that Axios report was not could be seen within this context, even though I believe that the Israeli firsters put that forward. In other words, even those who are Israeli firsters in the United States are gradually becoming fearful of what is happening to the United States because the way in which that will impact the mood towards the Israeli regime. And so I would imagine that quite a few Zionists and powerful people in the United States would be saying to themselves that, look, Netanyahu, Israel is becoming deeply unpopular in the United States. I think 60% now of Americans have they look negatively at the regime. And so if this continues, it becomes more entrenched and worse. And maybe if we remove Netanyahu and put someone else, some other genocidal monster in his place, we can say that the genocide and everything was Netanyahu and this is a new government and so on. Even though, according to polls and according to their own public statements by these opposition figures in Israel, they're just as genocidal. But in any case, this public relations they could have a public relations uh, opportunity to try to change the mood in the United States. So I think that what Iran is doing is basically what Professor Mearsheimer was also talking about, to push the United States towards greater economic hardship to a point where the United States has to say, must conclude that we have to prioritize ourselves now rather than the Israeli regime.
But I think the United States is at least slowly coming to the conclusion that they can't win this war militarily. But I'm wondering to what extent the U.S. can accept the peace, though. I mean, if they can't do war, but they can't accept peace either. I say this because, well, if I was Iranian and holding on to the Strait of Hormuz, I would not just have a toll for rebuilding. I would use this instrumentally to enhance my security. That is, I would put a little bit higher toll on countries that sanctions Iran because I would create economic incentives to remove these sanctions. I would put a bit higher tolls on countries that threaten Iran by hosting U.S. military bases. Again, putting some incentives to have them scale down or removed altogether. And again, you can also put a higher toll on countries that sell their oil in U.S. dollars to essentially put an end to the petrodollar system that links the U.S. security interests so closely to the region. Again, not advocacy. I'm just, if I was Iranian, I'm assuming that it's not just for reparations and rebuilding. So I guess these thoughts have also occurred in Washington as well. So to what extent do you think Trump could, well, twofold question. Do you think Iran would use the Strait of Hormuz instrumentally like this to also enhance its economic and military security? And to what extent does it become possible for the U.S. to essentially accept peace under those conditions?
I'm sure the Iranians are thinking that. I mean, as we speak, they are taking fees and they will continue to do so, and they will restrict certain ships from enemy countries or unfriendly countries from using the Persian Gulf. And they may indeed have a two-tier system, or they may have preferable rates for friends and not so preferable rates for unfriendly countries. That I think is something they would definitely be. They've already been talking about, I'm sure. I find it very difficult to believe that the United States can come to any peace agreement with Iran. this United States, this government, this state, this stand. Even if there is a ceasefire agreement, even if there is an agreement for the signed between the two sides in the coming days, or I doubt it's days, but in the coming weeks, I find, because it will be in two stages, as we all know. The first stage will be ending the blockade, ending the genocidal attacks on Lebanon, and retreating, and of course Gaza, and the return of Iranian stolen assets, and the waiving of sanctions for Iranian oil and energy exports for the duration of the agreement. But and in return, Iran will promise not to develop a nuclear weapon, which it has done hundreds of times. No big deal. And the shipyard of Hormuz will go back to normal, the number of ships that pass through. So, but that's the first stage. The second stage would be the removal of all sanctions on Iran. Many of them are in law. These Trump can't remove, and the House and the Senate, I find almost impossible to imagine them to do such a thing, to remove those sanctions. And then, of course, the Iranian nuclear program, which the Americans want Iran to put aside, and that's not going to happen either. So what sort of agreement would they be able to agree upon? All of that, these are big questions, and I find it almost impossible for Trump to be able to come to some sort of long-term agreement with Iran. So I'm not